connected. Okay, great. Shall we get started then? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here for the 4th webinar in the Change the World webinar series. We decided not to set too low a threshold for ourselves for our objectives for this series of events, and so we've decided that we should change the world. And the way that we were thinking about changing the world was advocating for inclusive dialogue across sectors about systems approaches, human-centered approaches, integrative approaches to urban safety, particularly in response to the crises occasioned by and also exacerbated by COVID-19, but also in response to the many, many years of experience and learning about urban safety, and really kind of thinking about this as an opportunity to revisit some of our key principles, to think innovatively and progressively, and to offer something to global civil society as an opportunity for partnership, for innovation, and for progressive action. And of course, particularly in response to the opportunity of the Crime Congress in March. So when I say we, I mean Fixed Africa, which, should I ask you to introduce Fixed, Barbara, or should I do it? Which I will introduce in a moment. And the NGO Alliance, represented here by Anna and Inge and Toby, as well as APCOF, the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. So Anna, if I could hand over to you for a moment to just introduce the NGO Alliance, and perhaps also you want to do a quick sales pitch on the final event next week.
So thank you very much. Can you see me perhaps? I don't know. Yes, you can.
Yes.
So good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you, Emma, for introducing the 3 organizations that have joined forces to organize this series of webinars. What happened was that over the past year, we really realized that this space for discussion was running the risk of shrinking instead of expanding, and different communities were facing similar problems, dealing with similar issues, but using different languages. So we thought of this series of webinars as an opportunity to bring together these different communities and discuss some problems that they share, and try to find common solutions, something that we can bring forward and recommend, also taking the opportunity of the UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice that is going to take place in the 2nd week of March, yes, from the 7th to the 12th of March in Kyoto. So I'm the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which is what is called an umbrella organization, bringing together several NGOs and individual experts who share an interest in the broad program of the United Nations on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which is mostly centered around the work of the Commission, same name, in Vienna. So the Alliance is really very, covers a variety of issues that go from the main crime conventions, the International Organized Crime, UN Convention Against Corruption, to the issues that are really more related to crime prevention as such, trying to unpack many of the problems and the issues that are related to addressing various aspects of crime prevention, especially in urban settings. So thank you for giving me the floor, and I'm back to you.
Thanks, Anna. Sean, would you like to say some words? Oh, I know you didn't mention webinar 5. I'll mention it in my introduction. Sean, would you perhaps like to just say a couple of words about APCOF and your role in this process and your objectives, etc.?
Thank you very much, Emma. Sean Tate, I'm the director of the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. We're delighted to be able to partner with FIXED and the Alliance in this series of webinars. The series, as Anna said, is examining urban safety, examining crime and violence prevention, looking at that through the particular and unique events that have taken place over the last months around COVID-19, and how we change the world and imagine a different future, building back better. So we're coming to the end of the journey now, looking at knowledge systems, and a lot of very kind of exciting thought presented, which we hope to take forward in our kind of engagements with various entities such as the Crime Congress presenting itself in March. So thanks very much, Emma.
Thanks, Sean. So just a quick background on the series. This is webinar 4. We had a webinar 0 where we introduced the notion of the process and some of the key sort of high-level frameworks that we would be thinking about and engaging with. Then we had a webinar 1, which was towards the end of last year, partnerships, collaboration, and integration to make urban safety possible, really looking at the ways that we make assumptions about partnerships, and often those assumptions trip us up, and how we rely on partnerships and collaboration, but how it's actually quite difficult. Then we had a really fascinating conversation on police and policing in an urban safety system, and particularly with an emphasis on police and policing in the context of public health, as a really quite stark example of the way that police and policing can be situated as one of a series of systemic mandates rather than as the primary role in delivering urban safety. Then we had a conversation about mental wellness and resilience as central to urban safety, and really acknowledging the derailing and damaging impacts of intergenerational trauma. That's in terms of people living in vulnerable communities, but also for frontline workers, for parents trying to break the cycles of vulnerability for their children, and how the impacts of trauma really need to be made explicit when we think about the types of strategies that we develop and the kind of impact that we are able to achieve with people who are suffering the damaging consequences of trauma. Then today we're talking about knowledge systems, which I'm really excited about. The notion that data and information are not are contextual, are not objective, and that demonstrating impact and influencing policy are really important aspects of knowledge and the generation of knowledge, the analysis of knowledge, and that we need to be explicit about how we think about knowledge and information and how we mobilize and deploy it to support and strengthen urban safety practice. And I'll introduce our lovely speakers in a moment. But just to say that there is another webinar coming next week on Wednesday at the same time, the final webinar in the series, in which we'll have panelists representing crime prevention, public health, gender, urban settlements, and peace building, who have been invited to respond to key points raised by speakers through the last few months of the webinar series. And that we're going to ask them some tough questions about how we take this work forward and how we expand, as Anna was saying, instead of kind of keeping on having the same conversation. And we plan to produce a practical set of recommendations as an output of the webinar series, which will be focused firstly on the Crime Congress, as we've mentioned, but also to reach beyond the urban safety sector and facilitate partners with other sectors and activists and actors who can benefit from integrated approaches. So that's next week. Put it in your diary, please. And for today, we are talking, as I said, about knowledge systems. We're thinking about there's kind of, in fact, Toby, I think if you would put up the slide, please, that would be very helpful. We've had a series of conversations in preparation for today, where we've talked about a kind of a series of key ideas that we need to cover in this conversation, and that knowledge practitioners in the urban safety sector and in the development sector need to kind of engage with and confront in generating practices for knowledge management and knowledge systems. So firstly, there are questions about what kind of measures we use, and traditionally in the crime prevention sector, there's always an emphasis on crime statistics as a way of measuring safety. And Adele gave the fantastic example when I was talking to her about saying that the murder rates are going up. And that doesn't tell us anything about the impact of our urban safety interventions, except to some extent that they aren't working. Then we have issues around, and we're going to have detailed discussion on all of this. Then we have issues around data, so data governance, evaluation, the credibility of data. Obviously, with the advent of information technology and digital technologies, geospatial technologies, there are huge opportunities for generating and accessing data. Who owns the data, how it's used, how it's generated, how it's analyzed. These are all questions that we need to think about quite carefully. And then we have the question of a systems approach to knowledge. So how do we build systems that are responsive to local environments and work through partnerships, inclusion, accessibility, that can deliver information and data that are locally relevant in time, that are accessible to the people that they need to be accessible to, and that are consistently useful in the generation of adaptive, agile, responsive, innovative, and inclusive policy. So, you know, the key thing that we started talking about was the link between data and policy. But as we've unpacked that, as you can see, there are kind of sets of issues that we need to think about along the way. Thank you very much, Toby. We might come back to that later. So we have 4 really fantastic speakers with us today, and thank you so much for joining us. We're going to structure the webinar as a conversation, so we're not going to have lots of any PowerPoint presentations. We've just got a conversation that we're going to unfold. Please feel free, if you have questions, to raise a hand, or questions or inputs. Raise a hand or put your comment in the chat. We really want to encourage dialogue and engagement. So some of our speakers know each other and have interacted before, some have not, so it should be an interesting conversation. We have with us Massimo Tomasoli, who is the permanent observer for International IDEA to the United Nations. Massimo is a policy specialist with extensive experience in democracy building, democratic governance, social development, evaluation, and aid effectiveness. And so we've really asked Massimo to be here kind of representing the other, you know, representing sectors outside of the urban safety focused sector, and helping us think about the way that we can learn from work that's being done in social development and democratic governance environments, but also how we could partner across sectors to support and enable and strengthen approaches and integrate work and practices as well. So thank you very much for being with us, Massimo. Please feel free to add if I have neglected to mention a key facet of your background. Then we have with us Karen Bozikovich, who is from the Organization of American States. And I just have managed to Knowledge Section Chief at OAS Department of Public Security. Previously, she was the Unit Coordinator of Political and Scenario Analysis in the Department of Democratic Sustainability and Special Missions. That sounds amazing. She's currently pursuing an MA in International Criminal Justice at John Lay College. She has a master's in Latin American Studies with a concentration in government from Georgetown. And as an undergraduate, she obtained 2 degrees, one in political science and the other in international studies from St. Andrews University in Argentina. So thank you so much for joining us, Karen. all of our speakers are joining us from somewhere along the east coast of the American continents. So we've had fun figuring out meeting times. Adele and I had our final conversation at what was 10:30 p.m. my time last night. So at least Adele and I have had an opportunity to prepare together. Adele Ramos from the Belize Crime Observatory. Sorry, now I've lost this bio. Here it is. Here, Adele is the technical coordinator of the Belize Crime Observatory. She manages the day-to-day operations. She's also the country's focal point for the implementation of the USAID-funded Info Segura project for Belize. This is a regional project that focuses on providing support for evidence-based decisions and policies with emphasis on citizen security agencies. So Adele really brings a background of practical, local experience of the way that the concepts that we are talking about play themselves out in a local community environment. So thank you so much for joining us, Adele, from Belize. And then we have Ariane de Palacio, who is the Director of Research at the International Center for the Prevention of Crime, and whose bio I've also managed to lose. Ariane is a specialist in crime and violence prevention, public and community safety. She works with public policy processes with an emphasis on information, design, implementation, coordination, and evaluation. She works with crime, violence, and conflict observatories and monitoring tools, and is working on innovative practices for urban safety labs. She also has a background in conflict analysis and prevention, public participation, and community stakeholder relations. Ariane, thank you very much for joining us from Montreal. And with that, I think that we should get started. We said that, well, in fact, we didn't say this, but I have shared this with the speakers, so I hope nobody will be too surprised, that I think we should start with a discussion where we define what we mean by knowledge and why we're talking about knowledge and not data or information, and why we talk about knowledge systems and not monitoring and evaluation. Karen, you had some quite sort of passionate thoughts about this, and I wonder if you might share them with us.
Yes, of course, Emma. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having us. So I'm not saying that data is not important, and usually when we think about public security, urban safety, crime prevention, crime control, we usually tend to think about data, and we tend to think about data with regards to the type of data that we collect, the different sources of data, and the quality of that data, with a particular emphasis on administrative data and quantitative data. But I think that we also need to start putting more focus or more emphasis in what is it that we do with that data, what kind of analysis are we producing with that data, and how that analysis is being used to impact decision-making processes and the design of policy interventions. And we also need to start putting much more emphasis on, particularly in regions such as Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, in how to create our own knowledge with regards to what works for creating urban safety, for reducing crime, and for crime prevention. And once we have created that knowledge, it's also very important to start sharing that knowledge and start disseminating that knowledge. And so when I think about data, I think about a collection in a raw, unorganized manner. And then when we work on that data, we create information so that we give that data some structure, and we give that data some context, some significance, and we add meaning to that data. And we finally move to a third stage or a third level, which is knowledge. And knowledge could be interpreted or defined as theoretical or practical understanding of a subject, like, for example, understanding how is it that you reduce crime. And so you can have various types of classifications with regards to knowledge. You can have tacit and explicit knowledge. You can have procedural, factual, conceptual knowledge. You can have knowledge as to when, what, why, how, when. And so I think it's really important that we start thinking, when we think about urban safety, crime control, crime prevention, of creating this knowledge, and this particular knowledge within specific areas. And both know data, information, and knowledge. I think that they should not be interpreted as ends in themselves. I don't think that they are the end objective of what we do, but they should be considered as a means to something else. In this case, they should be considered as a means to create urban safety, to reduce crime, to prevent crime. And so in that regard, we can think about data, information, and knowledge as resources. And if we think about data, information, and knowledge as resources, then we should think about how we manage those resources. We tend to manage economic resources, human resources. Then something similar should be done with regards to data, information, and knowledge if we conceive or we define them as resources. So to address urban safety and crime prevention and crime control, it's not only important to think about knowledge systems, but also to focus our attention on how to manage these resources, data, information, and knowledge, to create urban safety, to reduce crime, to prevent crime. And so a knowledge management system has to do with creating and managing processes for knowledge creation and capture, for knowledge transfer, and for knowledge application, use, and reuse. If we are to think about urban safety from this other perspective, or from a knowledge system perspective, from a knowledge management perspective, we also need to think about and identify the parts and the subparts of that system. Who are the actors integrating, conforming this broad system, this broad or narrow system, however you want to define it. But I think it's very important to think about, if we're going to think about a system, we need to think about its parts and subparts. And again, I think that it's not just about police and law enforcement. I think that we need to start including other actors, because urban safety, crime control, and crime prevention are not and cannot be the sole responsibility of police and law enforcement. And so I think that with this knowledge system and with this knowledge management system perspective, I think it opens up the door for us to include and invite other possible actors to integrate this system. And so when we think about which other actors, I think that the focus needs to be placed on who are the actors that have data, information, and knowledge that can somehow be helpful, productive, to create urban safety, to reduce crime, to prevent crime. And we have a wide variety of actors that can be considered, particularly if we are talking about urban safety, which has the capacity of narrowing down our interventions to a very local and very specific geographic area. And so we can include municipal governments, public health institutions, social services, transport authorities, city attorneys, private security firms, 911 systems and their dispatchers, city-wide inspectors, school principals, business owners, shelters. So there's a wide variety of actors that could be part of this system. And of course, we would need to think how these different actors are connected to each other, which is, for me, one of the most difficult parts to create or to build when we think about a system. So yes, you can have all these actors, but the key thing is how these actors are connected and how these actors start sharing data, information, and knowledge. So I'm going to stop here just to give the possibility for others to jump in.
Thank you, Karen. That is, we're thinking about knowledge systems, and I think it gives us some useful things to kind of hook our thinking onto, which is very useful. Ariane, I think that links very nicely to the issues of data governance that we've been talking about as well. And you also have quite a unique perspective as a research institute and in the research environment, seeing the way that power flows with knowledge, seeing who has access to it, how the strings that you've talked about that can sometimes be attached to it. So I think that yeah, maybe you could share some insights with us on that.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's just very, very interesting to go just after Karen, because she just summed up like the whole story so well. And when we talk about governance and we talk about knowledge systems, the important thing is to consider that when we look at these things, we look at processes. So we look at processes of how we, meaning that very complex, ever-changing, fluid systems of stakeholders and actors at all levels, look at how we understand these very complex challenges, how we prioritize and address them. So it's complexity over complexity. A complex stakeholder system looking at complex issues and trying to figure out how complex these ways of addressing that and of strategizing can be just put in place so that we don't forget anything or anyone in the process. And this is where governance is central to all of this issue, because since it's a process, it's a complex process. The entire question that just comes over and over throughout this process is how do we do that? Who is participating? And knowledge, in my opinion, is that ever-changing process where that really depends on who is at the table. What do we consider as being part of, relevant part of what knowledge could be? And for a long time in crime prevention and urban safety, this has been around, police justice data, criminal justice data, administrative data. Then we just integrated what we called like subjective data. So through all of these phases that were about feelings of safety and victimizations, etc. And then we're talking, we're looking at some more qualitative data, micro data. So looking at all these scales of what our knowledge can, the scales that our knowledge has to address when we talk about community safety, especially. So the entire territorial scope, where we look down to a specific community, a neighborhood, or we zoom out and look at the city in general, or how institutions and administrations can strategize at national, regional, or city level. So knowledge is this very multi-dimensional factor. And the governance of all that is very complex and is crucial to really understand, so that we don't miss any part that is very important. And when we talk about governance of knowledge, we talk about this input. So everything that flows into what we want to, understand, organize, as Karen put it, like this. We want to organize our data so that it becomes information, and then we just look at it through the prism of the issues that we want to address, so that it becomes knowledge and it becomes applicable, concrete knowledge about these specific issues. So it's really about looking at what we put in this machine, in this process. So this is the governance of our input data. And it can be extremely challenging in terms of how we can, for example, from an administrative data point of view, how can we break down a little bit that mentality of ownership of data, and try to, and this, I think that the Belize Crime Observatory and Adele Ramos can really speak to that issue. How do we, put all this data together How do we reconcile administrative ownership of data sets so that we can have kind of a multi-sectoral view of one question? But it's also how do we look at these blind spots that administrative data just cannot shed any light on? How do we mobilize stakeholders so that we can go into more qualitative that just speaks to who participates to this data. And then there is the governance of what we do with that knowledge that we've built. And this is something, especially when you, for example, we do work with the Urban Safety Laboratory here in Montreal, and we are working with administrative data that has a lot of strings attached to it in terms of confidentiality, what we can do with it. And so even the knowledge and the analysis that we produce, we really have to negotiate the whole deal in order to be able to disseminate it to the larger audience. So it's a process where you always have to negotiate around who is included in both the input and the output. And this is extremely important because this knowledge has to be somehow co-built, co-constructed and appropriated by the people who are going to use it. So whether it's administrations, program officers, people on the ground, frontline workers, or even community themselves. So you have to have a governance that allows everyone to be part of that process so that people can really be involved, mobilize, appropriate this process, and feel like it's theirs and they can really do something about it. And it's really something that we have really big challenges. We really face big challenges with. It's how do we use that knowledge so that it is utilized in the whole, opportunities that it offers. It is understood and it is integrated, and people act on it and really use that for not only strategies but also everyday practice.
Thanks, Ariane. I see two hands raised here, Adele and Evelyn. Adele, I'm due to respond. I was had intended to come to you for the perspective of the practical experience of the way that these concepts and ideas play themselves out in Belize, and then Evelyn will come to you after Adele.
I can defer for the moment because I think I could address it under that topic that you just mentioned. So the other speaker may go ahead.
Okay, Evelyn, you had a hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise the hand. I just was listening carefully to all your interventions.
You were stretching.
Yes, maybe, yes. It's necessary with all these many webinars. Yes.
Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Thank you. Bye.
Barbara, would you like to ask your question before we go to Adele?
Yeah, I would actually. It's something that's just.
Barbara and I are here in the room together, as you can see.
So I just want to say that in both of those two fascinating inputs, and thank you so much for them. The one thing that has become an obsession with me is that when we talk about knowledge about urban safety, we tend to talk about what we want less of. We tend to talk about and therefore measure what we want less of. But the best you can get if you measure crime, and we talk about urban safety. And so I kind of feel like, obviously, Ariane, you know well that when we talk about having to negotiate the use of data, I think that there is a hierarchy of data, and I think that that both of you have mentioned it, that some data is regarded as more powerful than other data. But actually lived experience is probably the most important data that there is. And yet we don't value it in the same knowledge systems, possibly because we don't have statistical data to put in. So as you said, Ariane, sometimes there is subjective data, but we're not even talking about that. We're talking about using the lived experience of people to inform what we want more of in our society, and to, as Doris Summer would say, to inspire human dynamism in a very positive way. So
Emma, you're on mute.
right through that?
No, I muted.
No, just
I
the
muted
last
10 seconds ago
30
because
seconds.
Inga sent me a message to say my typing was very loud. I'm taking notes. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, you were saying.
It's fine. I was just saying about wanting to include in our knowledge systems the opportunities to promote positive human dynamism, and I'm quoting Doris Summer there, but to look at the ways in which we address what we have learned through years of collecting data about crime, and we find not crime prevention mechanisms, but urban safety promotion mechanisms. So we're not aiming to prevent crime, we're aiming to create something else. And I would love to see that as part of data, which obviously, you know, can be widely shared, because there's no reason not to democratize it. And therefore, knowledge becomes something that is democratically owned in the sphere of urban safety, as well as creating something of value. I hope that makes some sense.
It does. Sorry, I was so excited by what you were saying that I was typing away, and then Inga said, it's very loud. Sorry, and then I muted you. We're definitely going to come back to that issue of what we want more of and what we want less of, and how there is a link between what we measure and what we place a value on, of course, because the things that we can demonstrate that are working or that have an impact are the things that we will continue to invest in. And so we really need to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve and what we're measuring and where we place value. But before we go there, I would like to come to Adele to get some inputs from you, Adele, on your experience of the governance of data and the sort of practical implications of some of the concepts we've been talking about.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's already been a very fulfilling experience for me, listening to the speakers who have gone before. I'd like to say that in terms of the Belize Crime Observatory, it was established legally and formally in 2016. When I say legally, it is in the context of the whole citizen security structure for Belize. As an institution, though, there is not any law on our books that says that this is a legally instituted body. And so that is where we would want to go next in terms of having some sort of formal structure that's enshrined in law, like something like a statutory body would have legislation. It wouldn't necessarily be a statutory body, but having specific legislation, because that in itself would provide a more solid and structured framework for the kinds of things that the speakers who have gone before us have discussed, such as data governance and having these sorts of structured arrangements and providing clarity to all our interagency partners. And so that is in the road ahead, and we hope that that would be achieved actually during the course of this year. But going back to 2016, when the observatory was launched, it was launched as the National Repository for Crime, Data, and Information. So we're talking here about a knowledge base, right? And so yes, we do work with statistics and data, but we do work with a wider information base. And so the repository is there as a resource for our partners, for our agencies, to be able to access a broader knowledge base. And it's not just information and documentation that's produced by Belize, by the public sector. There's international content there. And what we've been doing at the observatory since last year is restructuring that interface. So one of the things about having a repository is that you would want it to be structured such that when people visit that repository, they're not lost. So it has to be user friendly. It has to be structured in a way that people can make decisions as to, if I'm seeing this content, am I interested in it? Will it meet my needs? And that sort of thing. And so that's been a work in progress. And we've been repopulating it now that we've restructured it, because we realize that it's useless to have information on a site and then people cannot properly navigate it. And so these are some of the things that actually are a priority for us to ensure that our users can access and they can make those decisions whilst they're searching through our knowledge base. So we've prioritized that, making the website more interactive, so we don't just focus on the numbers, we expand into other types of information. And it's not just crime, it's looking broader at the whole public safety, citizen security landscape. So work in progress there, and we'd like to, of course, thank all our partners who have supported us through this process, including the OAS, the IDB, the USA, the UNDP, because really and truly, the strength of what the observatory has done has been through our international development partners or donor agencies who have made the resources available, who have provided the technical support that we needed. And the Belize Crime Observatory is a very small entity, but the Belize Crime Observatory is that link to some of these other agencies within the whole citizen security public safety landscape. So for example, when the Belize Crime Observatory benefits, the Belize Police Department benefits, the National Forensic Science Service benefits, the Belize Central Prison benefits, the Judiciary benefits, the National Women's Commission benefits, the Gender-Based Violence Surveillance Committees benefits, and we try as much as possible to spread these benefits across agencies. And how do we do that? We do that by incorporating and involving them in the processes. So one of the main areas is, for example, capacity building. Actually, last year in the midst of COVID, we implemented a course on the gender perspective in information management processes, right? And this is something that was done in Honduras as a part of a wider information management training. But because the issue of gender-based violence is so important for us here in Belize, and there's not that much exposure for our agencies, we felt that we could take that one module and expand it, flesh it out, and make it our own, customize it for our agency needs. And so we took that module and we customized it, and we had participation from a whole range of agencies, and of course these gender-based violence committees as well. And it was really to raise their awareness of, first of all, the international frameworks, the realities that are experienced not just in Belize, but in other countries, and particularly in the midst of COVID, where, of course, there was a lot of emphasis on gender-based violence and particularly domestic violence. It was extremely timely. And so we even had the judiciary involved. We had a Supreme Court justice involved. We had persons from the police department. We had the National Women's Commission partnering with us and bringing on board all the gender-based violence committees from all across the country, and even personnel from the Ministry of Health. So we're looking at the entire gender-based violence surveillance continuum, right, for Belize. They were a part of this process, and we don't want it to end there. Of course, we are committed to finding ways to continuing this process of collaboration and knowledge sharing, because it's so very critical. But it's not just about sharing the knowledge, but now how do we translate that into meaningful actions, into meaningful interventions, into even raising the awareness within our communities at the community level. And so there's a need there then for us to take it to the next step. And we've begun that conversation, and we want to take the next steps going forward. So when we talk about the Belize Crime Observatory, it's not just data and information, but looking at all these facets of building knowledge, building capacity, building awareness, and people also bringing in their experiences through that process. Another dimension of what we do is supporting interagency collaboration and data sharing. So I mentioned a while ago a number of agencies that we work with. We found in sourcing data, for example, I'll give you the example of road traffic fatalities, that different agencies were reporting different figures. And I thought to myself, I said, but if we're all a part of the same system, why is it that we cannot all be on the same page? And the problem there was that people were not sharing data. And so we brought everybody together. Everybody brought their data sets. We compared, we validated, we investigated, and then together, these agencies were able to come up with a consolidated set of data, everybody bringing their pieces of the puzzle so that it's more accurate and it's more comprehensive. And we could have walked away from that process knowing that we were better off than when we came in. So we did that last year for road traffic fatalities. And then we had another series of sessions this year in January. Of course, it had to be virtual. It couldn't be in person like last year. But what we did was then looking at the 3 data sets that were prioritized. So they were homicides, road traffic fatalities, and suicides. And we engaged in that process yet again, of course, now expanding beyond 1 data set. And we were able to do that for those 3. And again, we came off better than we went in, with more complete, more accurate, more comprehensive information. And so it underscores the value of people not operating in their own silos, keeping their information to themselves, because information is power, but there's so much more power when we come together and we consolidate and we put our pieces of the puzzle together. So I think that in terms of the perspective of data and information, building knowledge, one of the gaps there, of course, is looking at the traditional knowledge, the experiences of people. Belize has never implemented a crime victimization survey. We did a mini survey on people's perception on their safety in 2018, where we had GIS, Geographic Information Systems Day, and we just thought that maybe since we're having a lot of people coming into this event, let's ask them how they feel about their own personal safety, their perceptions of the police and that sort of thing. But I think going beyond that sort of test survey, I think we need something far more structured, and that's why we've been advocating for a crime victimization survey, because we do have agencies that need data and information. They need this broader knowledge base to be able to properly plan their interventions. Co-creating knowledge, that is great, absolutely. But making people, the wider communities, a part of the process. So one of our recommendations too is in terms of, rather than just getting information from the police, the wider community is also a source of information. The media is a source of information, complementary information. Yes, it's not coming from a government entity, but that doesn't mean that they're not providing information that could help us to understand what has been happening or what's changing on the ground as it is changing. So we've been also advocating for those sorts of things, to integrate those sorts of dimensions into our knowledge base and enhancing people's participation in the process. So Ariane talked about the complexities of data governance, and indeed for us here in Belize, we have been challenged by a number of factors. So last year we did a needs assessment and gap analysis, and there were some critical needs and gaps that were underscored. But one of the things that is still haunting us is that some of our agencies still work with a manual process in terms of handling the data that's coming into them, you know, or the data that they're collecting. So I'll give you a case in point. We have the National Forensic Science Service, which has a huge book of the dead. And this book of the dead, it's a huge, huge book. It probably weighs maybe more than 20 pounds. I don't know. It's a huge book. And this is where doctors record information on autopsies, right? And there's a need to then transition from that, because, you know, when they have to then take the information from that book of the dead and input it into their computer systems, there's room for error, right? So every step of the process, there is room for error. And if you then have a more structured electronic process in place, and you structure it such that you minimize your chances of errors, you know, the way you structure your systems, then it would mean that whatever comes through that process would be more accurate. And of course, if, you know, you then putting those systems in place, it would mean that the chances of you having more complete information would be higher, because, you know, nobody's getting tired having to write and write and write. So I think these are some of the fundamental things that we need to address. We have another situation where, in terms of the management of judicial data, where some locations do better than others because of human resource constraints. So you have persons who have been assigned with data entry responsibilities who have other primary responsibilities. So data entry is not their primary responsibility, right? And so you have a backlog that you cannot cure, because as time goes by, the backlog gets worse. And so a lot of the information, and it's not just data, but some of it is qualitative too, is there in hard copy, and it doesn't get transposed, it doesn't get transformed to the kinds of now information products that decision makers can use. And so, for example, our Chief Justice is really keen on us now getting that kind of transformation across the country, so that we can make that shift from having a lot of this information still in paper form, still sitting on someone's desk, getting it into, because they do have an information management system, but it won't get in the information management system if it's sitting on someone's desk. So how do you change that? You know, there's also the need for a culture shift. So, you know, the things that we value or principles, what is our data culture? What is our knowledge culture, if we want to take it a step further? And in the public sector, it is a challenge, because we know that some of these things in some institutions, they're not prioritized. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way. It's not prioritized. And there needs to be that shift to prioritize building this knowledge base. Capacity building and training, especially for people on the front line, needs to also be prioritized. So we have, for example, a law on our books that says that sex offenders who leave the prison are required to notify. So there's a requirement legally for sex offender notification. But how many of our officers are even aware of this legislation? How many of them are even aware of what to do when a sex offender comes and says, I came to report? Because when they leave the prison, they are told that they need to report. So there's a gap there. And we know of this because the institutions tell us that this is a problem, right? So these are just some examples of some of the practical realities and some of the gaps and areas if we're going to be strengthening then our knowledge base or knowledge systems to enhance urban safety. Thank you.
Thanks, Adele. There's just such fascinating examples of the way that lived experience always disrupts and undermines the ideas that the example that you gave about the consultation on a policy process, which was a really important overhaul of the sexual offences legislation in Belize, and was a really great opportunity for bringing data, for enabling consultation, which was derailed because of a political process that had nothing to do with data, information, or knowledge. It was something to do with political processes. And so I think that it's really important for us, as we kind of create these lofty goals for integration and being so progressive, that we're also really able to think about the realities of, particularly in vulnerable environments, of applying these ideas. Massimo, I wanted to come to you. You gave us a really interesting example of election-related violence, which was really useful, firstly, from the point of view of thinking about contextualizing administrative data, but also from the point of view of how deeply aligned urban safety knowledge needs are, and practices and processes are, with sectors that we may never have previously engaged with before. I wonder if you could share that example with us.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much for inviting me at this impressive exchange. Yes, I made the example of election-related violence because that is one of the most evident links that I can see between the realm of democracy assistance and the work that we are carrying out. But in highlighting that issue, I want to stress that we are coping all the time with challenges of definitions and understanding of exactly what you were saying. What is knowledge? Whose knowledge is taken into account? What is the use of this knowledge? And I embody in this definition of knowledge also the elements of data and information, as you said at the start. Let me give you just an example. There is a recent publication, 2019, by Inken von Borsiskovsky, and she wrote about the credibility challenge, how democracy aid influences election violence. We have to be aware that actually electoral assistance itself may spark electoral violence in some situations. One of the elements that is quite interesting from her analysis is that it is so difficult to label violence, to categorize violence and frame it in political terms. Let me give you a very specific example about this. As International IDEA, we are engaged in a conversation with UN Women on political violence against women and indicators that may capture that phenomenon. There was a reference before to domestic violence, which has increased under COVID-19. We shouldn't forget also the other element, which is partly overlapping with domestic violence, but it is about political violence against women. So how do we define an offense as a political offense, as an offense that is targeting individuals or a group within the society and creates a barrier to political participation and eventually to political representation and eventually to policy making that addresses inequalities, in this case, gender inequalities. That is crucial because you have cases of harassment, for example, online harassment for female candidates during election campaigns, that are not necessarily defined as acts of political violence, whereas they have a political impact, a political effect, both in terms of targeting the behavior of those particular candidates, and also in terms of discouraging political participation by other prospective candidates who do not enter the political arena because they they observe what is happening. Let me call in that respect for the possible way out. So there were in these previous interventions also references to how we can manage data, how we can provide some sort of technical solutions to fill this gap and address the challenges. And we do have some examples there. At International IDEA, we have developed an election risk management tool. And this looks at internal and external factors. It looks at contextual, the contextual meaning of data. It looks at combining different sources. It has been tested, this as a tool, by civil society organizations in Colombia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also in Kenya. And let me add one additional actor to the list that was made by Karen, I think. These are election commissions that manage, that are in charge with the management of elections, may actually collect and do collect data and information about risks of violence, and this comes from the other sources that have been quoted: courts, police, media, mainstream media, and in some cases also the observatories that monitor, for example, social media. Now, there is a big issue of capacity there. There are election management commissions that have strong built-in capacities, and other election management commissions that have so many different tasks that they have to comply with and on which they have to deliver, and they can't have the capacities to monitor those risks in a way that could actually be very, very helpful in order to prevent violence during elections, before elections, or after elections. Because the other important concept here is that we should not focus on election day, we should not focus on elections as events, we should look at the electoral cycle within which information, knowledge, and data may help policymakers and all the other responsible actors to take the appropriate decisions in order to prevent and address structural issues related to political violence. But I want to add another element, maybe another layer to what has been so far discussed. Many refer to statistics. Data are very important. Quantitative and qualitative statistics have been recalled, and I cannot be more in agreement on as regards the quality of data. But I'd like also to stress the importance of, and this is related to what you mentioned about experience, lived experiences, and also to what Barbara Holtman said before, the importance of ethnographies of urban policing. I've been so impressed by the work of an anthropologist who wrote, Didier Fassin, who wrote about France, the policing responses to riots, urban riots in 2005. He published this first in French and then in 2013 in English, Enforcing Order, an ethnography of urban policing. And he talks about democracy there. Why? Because crime, urban safety has become increasingly one of the main issues in election campaigns. And political entrepreneurs have made extensive use of statistics and also of what reverberates on mainstream media, on the information, during election campaigns in order to get support around what we could call the politics of fear. And I must say that this politics of fear that is so rewarding in the short term for those who make use of that has influenced both conservative and progressive politician agendas. That is so difficult to understand if we want to adopt the forward-looking approach that Barbara made a plea on in her intervention when she referred to not looking simply at crime prevention mechanisms, but also at urban safety promotion mechanisms. So that is a major issue, because it is also about how do we categorize offenses. So over time, there has been a change in the attitude of the public with respect to the importance of racial profiling, for example, in the work of the police. And if we compare what happened 20 years ago and what happened maybe 5 years ago, or at the time Didier Fassin analyzed in 2005 the riots in France, and what happened also in the US, for example, during the presidential campaign and the Black Lives Matter movement, which is addressing one of the most deeply rooted structural inequalities that is shaping politics in this country. We can see the importance of knowledge, because it is really about not only who's producing knowledge, whose knowledge is shared, but it's also about who is manipulating knowledge, who is actually making use of the knowledge for short-term political gains, and shaping a public conversation in such a way that influences the broad spectrum of the political arena, so that you see that hijacked also by progressive, for influencing progressive discourses. A similar conversation could actually take place on the use of the nexus between mass migration and urban safety in Europe over the last 3 years, that has been analyzed in the UN also during the work of the conference on mass migration. So these are the two elements I would like to stress. Crime statistics may become a major ammunition in election campaigns and may be used and manipulated by political entrepreneurs. And the other element is that data are very loosely defined, and it's sometimes difficult to shape them in a proper conceptual framework, so that we can, for example, properly capture political violence against women as a barrier to the participation of in political arenas of women. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. I think this is so fascinating because, as we go through the process, or as urban safety practitioners are going through the process of trying to understand the scope of the systemic nature of urban safety, I've recently been reading Manfred Max Neef, and I'm sure that those of you, the Latin American scholars, will recognize his work. But of course, there is a link between political stability, autonomy, agency, resilience, and safety. So, in fact, to be able to understand those nuances and the ways that people are experiencing vulnerability in a number of different dimensions is actually really fundamental. It's not simply that we can learn from democracy and governance data, knowledge, analysis and gathering systems, but also that we need to be thinking about those dimensions as we think about urban safety ourselves, because we need to understand that that vulnerability manifests in a number of different ways and impacts the ability of people to participate, to live their best lives, to access the types of opportunities that are fundamental to promoting urban safety. I really wish that there would be time for us to understand more about the way that you contextualize crime statistics and understand the political nuances and the kind of swirling social processes that are around them, and how you contextualize that data. It really sounds absolutely fascinating to me. Thank you so much for sharing. I do want us to get on though, because I think we all had a couple of really interesting examples about COVID-19 and the way that it firstly spotlighted gaps in our knowledge management systems, but also exacerbated them. Ariane, you had a really interesting example about people, sort of traditionally vulnerable groups, and their experiences of lockdown and the sort of heavy restrictions, and the way that typical administrative data was interacting with those experiences. I wonder if you can share that story with us.
Well, yeah, COVID here has had a number of, I mean, COVID in itself didn't have much effect on public safety and urban safety, but sanitary measures and distanciation and all these public health measures have had a great deal of consequences here. Even more so since the beginning of winter, that here in Montreal is very harsh. And it has had a great deal of consequence on the homeless population, which is here in Montreal typically extremely vulnerable during the winter season, and more generally throughout the year, extremely vulnerable to social and racial profiling, since not only is it a population that presents with higher levels of mental health issues, drug and alcohol and other substances dependency issues, but is also disproportionately indigenous. And racial and social profiling by the police service has always been a great problem. And with the curfew measures, especially for the last couple of months, the homeless populations have been increasingly targeted by the police. So there has been a judgment a couple of weeks ago that basically states that when you don't have a home to go to, it's a bit useless to be fined for being in the street, especially when you don't have $1,500 to give in the first place. But that didn't stop harassment, because now homeless people are being harassed to prove that they are homeless. And since they are also, for a lot of them having substance abuse issues, that whole situation led homeless people to hide from the police. And that has led to a couple of really dramatic incidents in which, hiding from the police in inebriated states, they died from hypothermia. So this is something that doesn't show in administrative data. And when community-based organizations have really tried to alert public authorities and especially the police on the issues, because they've seen a dramatic decrease of their services, like a 50% decrease in terms of supervised injection sites, since more, drug users generally tend to use after 8 p.m. So their day is pretty much from afternoon until late at night or early morning, which is, interacting with the curfew limits, because these people, even if they were homeless and therefore were supposedly exonerated, exempted from the application of these rules, they have drug on them, and they were really scared to be, stopped and controlled and searched by the police, which they are like multiple times in over the 1 hour time. Sometimes they can be stopped and searched up to 5 times. I heard from community-based services, and the reaction from the police has been, our data doesn't show it, so therefore it doesn't exist. And this speaks a little bit more to what administrative data is and what we should do about it. We have this tendency to use administrative data as Barbara was mentioning it, as kind of the gold standard of data, because it just obeys some methodological rules, data collection rules. It is much broader, more systematic, and basically because we've always done that, we've started by that, so therefore it is the core and the heart of what we know about crime and safety. But administrative data was never thought of, designed, conceptualized, and collected to inform urban safety or crime prevention. It was done to just inform administrative processes. So crime data is collected for what? Crime data and police data is collected to build on cases and feed into the criminal justice system, and also feed into some internal processes to the criminal justice system, performance, strategic development of the justice system, but it was never designed to inform policies in terms of crime prevention, and even less so in terms of public safety and community safety and urban safety. The differences being that when we talk about crime prevention, yes, we focus on crime. When we talk about urban safety and community safety, we focus on everything else but crime. We focus on the well-being and the feeling of safety of the general population, and not going after who we think are the problematic population, which is something that, may seem extremely obvious. But when we talk about, crime prevention and urban safety policies with decision makers, either at borough or city or, provincial, national, international level, most of the time they tend to, assimilate crime prevention and community safety to going after the bad guys and reducing crime and, curbing crime and just acting on crime and violence. Maybe losing sight of what we do that for. And this is where I would really, be agree with what Barbara said. Is it what we want? Is reducing crime and violence the end goal? No, the end goal is to have healthy, safe communities and to have an access to the city for everyone, including the more vulnerable groups. Meaning, if indigenous people, people of color, women, children, the elderly, families, immigrants, LGBTQ+ people, if these categories of people can access the city, meaning being mobile, move throughout the city at any time, any day, being able to access services, being able to use what the city offers in terms of culture, recreation, public spaces, etc. If these people can do that safely, then this is the goal. Reducing crime and violence is maybe a sub-objective of that ultimate goal. So we need to really think really hard when we talk about knowledge systems. We need to think about this whole process of building knowledge together understanding what our challenges are, and we need to do that not from these very administrative perspectives. So putting these crime stats at the very, you know, upper end of the pyramid of information, and really decenter, like shift focus from what we think is that problem to what we want the end goal to be. And this might, you know, seem like a unicorn kind of obvious Miss America pageant type of speech, but it's something that is very present when we talk about, when we talk with decision makers and policy makers at all levels in our work. For example, and I had that discussion yesterday. Here in Montreal, we have in certain sectors of the city really an increase in gun violence, and gun violence, implicating younger and younger teenagers. So it's not anymore linked to organized crime, street gangs. It's now linked to kind of youth violence, and this is something that, you know, for the public opinion is, you know, it's really something that creates this trauma within these communities and creates this kind of general anxiety and panic, social panic, really fueled by the media, etc. So we're kind of in that, you know, hysteria, and we're doing a local safety audit in the heart, like in the borough that is really considered as being problematic, and we were trying to really, you know, talk to these elected officials and I mean, like the entire administrative officers to just try to make them a little bit shift focus from maybe a 5 or maybe 2% of young people who might be at high risk or already criminalized, and, you know, not losing sight that, you know, violent youth in this type of situation have been, you know, the victim of violence too. So they're victims too. It's a whole, it's not like 3 kids being the bad guys and the rest are being victims. It's kind of a much more complex issue, but it was like, you really need to shift your focus towards the families and the mothers who just don't let their kids to the street to play because they're scared, and also the community workers who are deserting these areas and these places because they're scared for their lives, and also to the business owners and the you know, public transit users. You need to shift your focus towards these communities and not only focusing on the crime stats. They were talking to us about what the crime stats are, and can you do some hotspot mapping, and can we really pinpoint where and when it happens, etc. And it was like, you know, don't want it to happen anymore. You need also to look at these places as how we can, what is the end goal for these places? You know, how can we address the situation and look at the situation so that mothers can go back to these parks with their children, and old people can go and have a walk there. So administrative data not only is not objective, it was designed for one purpose, and it's not the purpose of promoting healthy, safe communities. It's the purpose of having this administration work. That's it. And we need to shift focus from that and go into micro data. And it's super important because decision makers are going to act upon what we give them as knowledge. And if this knowledge is formed of you know, a whole lot of perspectives that really focus on the micro level, the community, the experience of people, and in the end, what we want to achieve with all of that, it's going to change dramatically the way that we design policies and the way that we actually act on urban safety issues. So it's not unicorn speech. It's so important, and it is very, very, very crucial to what we do.
Thanks, Ariane. I think, yeah, I love the notion of it's people moving through the city. It's families spending time together. It's access to opportunities. It's love and happiness. It's well-being. Those are the things that we're trying to achieve. And you know, that really links, as you know, to the work that Barbara and I do on always working towards a vision of what it looks like when it's fixed. Where are we trying to go with this? And let's figure out what we need to do in order to achieve that next. I just asked Toby to bring this slide up in response to Adele's question about indicators. What are the indicators for urban safety? Barbara and I have had the privilege of participating in a process led by UN Habitat Safer Cities, which began a few years ago with the publishing of the UN system-wide guidelines for safer cities and human settlements, and then through various processes, continued in an expert group meeting, which took place last year in October, and we now are working on the consolidation of an urban safety monitor of 15 indicators for urban safety. So I'd like to talk very briefly about that, because I'm not actually one of the speakers. But first, I would just like Barbara to talk a little bit about this slide and about what the sort of principled approach was that came, you know, that motivated the slide and that also underlay the expert group meeting last year.
Thanks, Em. I'll be very quick, but Ariane, I think there's nothing wrong with unicorns. I don't think we should ignore unicorns. I think there's a very big difference between monitoring and evaluation and dreaming big. And very often we think that, for instance, poor and vulnerable communities want something that we can't give them. But actually, if we can make everybody useful, we begin to discover from them that their dreams and aspirations are not dependent on us giving them more. They are on enabling their engagement much more. And I think that's, you know, it's really important. And it's where we started to develop this slide, where I was moderating the expert group meeting, and every day, every speaker, on the urban safety monitor, and every speaker I put into somewhere on the slide in terms of what they were measuring. And you can see that a huge amount of both the tools and the issues that are measured are actually clustered around the less of. So what people who are producing big data and producing what is regarded as credible data are producing is very often data about crime reduction. Whereas, and I think that it's very important to note that, because we talk about what data is available and what systems are available. But in fact, as long as we are led by what data is available, I believe that we will restrict ourselves from finding credible measures and promoting city interventions that actually look at what is very often at the moment seen as unicorn speak. But why need it be? So, and that is the contribution at the other end of this continuum, that is not only qualitative in its nature, typically, but is also about things where we have to make the link to urban safety that we do not require people to make who are measuring the reduction of crime. So we assume that if there are less homicides, that means that our city is safer. But in fact, when we come to the issues of inclusion, of building trust, of collaboration between cities, for instance, and neighborhoods and communities, democracy, human rights, the issues of gender equity. I mean, why is it that after all these years, we still regard women as vulnerable, as being in a vulnerable group? I remember listening to Bill Clinton when he was president saying, women and other minority groups. And I remember it really making me mad, because we should not be accepting that women will always be vulnerable, will always be minorities in terms of participation, etc. We've got to set some real-time timelines, I believe, to measure more of women's inclusion in creating safe urban environments, rather than less of the gender-based violence, rape, gun violence, etc. So this slide, I mean, it reflects 3 days of interventions from people who are obsessed with measuring urban safety over 3 days, which is one of the most fascinating things I've ever done in my life. But it has made me obsessed with how do we increase the credibility of the unicorn interventions? How do we bring the unicorns in from fantasy and into the reality of what we define as urban safety? And in so doing, democratize data, make people more useful, give them agency in making themselves safer, in designing what neighborhoods should look like, in what they want access to, and in promoting then cities as being better partners in urban safety issues. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. We can take that slide down again, Toby. I think what you've just raised, Barbara, really links to the kind of closing theme of discussions, which is around, all right, so we've talked a lot about knowledge and what it means and the structural barriers to accessing it, generating it, using it, sharing it, and to the advocacy work that needs to be done at local, global, and regional levels to enable better access. And we need to come to the question about policy. We need to come to the question about the link between all of this knowledge and information and the way that we're making decisions. I mean, I think, Ariane, the notion of adaptive learning is also often treated as a bit of a unicorn. And I wanted to say that my daughter, who is almost 3, would definitely agree with Barbara that we need more unicorns, not less. But the notion of adaptive learning, the notion of learning from what we're doing, making it safe to fail, to learn from our failures, and then creating opportunities to strengthen and refine our policies and our strategies in response. Before I ask each of the speakers to make one last comment each on that question, and we haven't had time to get through all of the questions that I had prepared, unfortunately, so we will have to just all meet again and spend another 2 hours having what I think is a very interesting conversation. I just want to quickly take you, Adele, in response to your question about what are the indicators for urban safety. And so we are, as I said, we are in the process of consolidating this last few years of work on the system-wide guidelines. And so we are in the process of consulting and consolidating. So I'm not presenting something, I'm not presenting on behalf of UN Habitat Safe Cities. I'm not presenting a finished product. This is just the kind of current status in terms of a set of 15 high-level indicators that can be used to measure urban safety status. And the idea is also that these should be indicators which should be relevant at local level, at regional level, national, and global, so that we're able to learn from one another about the way that we implement and use these indicators in local environments. And you'll see that many of the indicators, we haven't yet gotten to the point of trying to figure out what the data sources would be, although we are optimistic that we will be able to find good data sources. But you'll see that we are really expanding beyond the traditional scope of crime prevention indicators. So what we've done is we've categorized, when I say we, I mean through this long process, which I haven't been a part of since the beginning, and I'm not claiming that I am the owner of this tool in any way. But what has happened is that we've categorized these indicators into 3 evaluation categories. The first one is crime, and that's obviously where we always start. The second one is community, so community status, and I'll get to the indicators in a second. And the third one, which is one that we've kind of spoken about very briefly, is local governance, so the operations of local authorities and the way that they are able to implement safety as a transversal lens through integration, collaboration, and partnership approaches. So the under the crime under the crime evaluation category, we've got the pretty obvious ones. We've obviously got crime rates, perceptions of safety, which I think has gained more and more traction as an indicator for safety over the last years. Justice and access to justice, including obviously corrections, convictions, and informal justice as well. And then we have a category of petty offences and questions of the criminalization of vulnerability, which you alluded to, Ariane, and Massimo, you alluded to it as well, the notion of people who are marginalized groups, homeless, drug users, sex workers, people against whom bylaws and petty offences can be used to manipulate and control them, and to criminalize their choices and their identities. And then we've added vulnerability as the other category. So, and that, you know, all of these things have to be disaggregated against different types of groups and experiences, and be able to really generate localized information. So that's the crime category. And then in the second category, we have community. So we start under community with human rights. What is the status of human rights? And part of what this tool aims to do is to suggest that we, very much aligned to the conversations that we've been having here, we integrate different types of data sources, and we partner with organizations whose mandates are not obviously traditionally aligned to urban safety. But when you dig a little bit deeper into what that systemic vision is of what it looks like when it's fixed, you realize there is actually a much higher degree of alignment. Which is also why I really appreciated Massimo's example of the risk assessment of election-related violence. So we would start with human rights. We would have to measure civic participation, so autonomy, agency, hearing the voices of community members, space for dissent, which, as I say, we haven't. This process is not yet identifying data sources, but Massimo, I think we'll probably be contacting you soon to ask for your inputs. Community consultation, community engagement processes, and inclusion. So that's human rights, civic participation, neighborhoods. What is the safety status in neighborhoods? Are there local partnerships? Are there local associations and networks of support? Resilience would be the next one. So individual, interpersonal, and community resilience, how people recover from setbacks. And then human dynamism, which I'm absolutely sure is a term that will be controversial and will be debated at length, and probably come up with a much more complicated definition of it. But what we mean by human dynamism here is creativity, courage, participation, imagination, curiosity, social cohesion, participation. So those are the community outcomes. And of course, all of these have a safety lens on them, but they also extend broader than just the issue of safety. So civic participation, we need to understand whether there are structures and systems and processes that enable civic participation, because this is something which is going to be fundamental to achieving the social cohesion, which again, another controversial term, which will really underlie the social structures that we need to have in place in order to be able to achieve urban safety. Sorry, I'm taking much longer to describe this than I should. And the third category is local governance. And there we measure transversality, so management and governance in local government, policy and strategy, mentions of safety, alignment to global, regional, national, and local policies, capacity, so capacity of local governments for communication, systems operations, collaboration, transversality, interaction with data, communication and advocacy, the existence of communication strategies, their reach, their effectiveness, and then innovation. So there are 6 here: transversality, policy and strategy, capacity, communication or advocacy, and innovation. And Adele, we would love to have a more detailed conversation with you about those. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to invite engagement with this group around those indicators. They are, as I say, the preliminary output of a process of consultation and engagement. So sorry for taking so long. I would like to ask, starting with you, Karen, for some final closing comments on the link between everything that we've been discussing about knowledge systems and policy, and how we really deploy and mobilize data to strengthen our policy and strategy decisions.
Okay, yes. So the most straightforward answer, or the most typical answer, would be that we need to use data and data analysis to inform decision-making processes, policy intervention designs. But I would like to focus on two other tools, if you want, research and evaluation. Because I do think that both research and evaluation are two other very important sources of knowledge that sometimes are not that widely used for a variety of reasons, but I think that we need to start paying more attention to these other tools. And in the case of research, I would say that it's not so much this traditional or academic research, but I would try to focus the attention more on action research. And by action research, what I mean is bringing researchers with a more, if you want, academic or scientific training, working alongside practitioners, people that are working actually on the street, that understand what's going on in real life situations, to assess and research together specific problems that are affecting specific communities, and to formulate and implement interventions to address that problem, and to include some kind of evaluation. And again, it doesn't have to be an evaluation design based on an experimental kind of design. We can work with quasi-experimental or non-experimental evaluation designs, but we need to start bringing in evaluation to these kinds of policy interventions. And if it doesn't work, then the evaluation will help you understand better why it is not working, learn from that, and make adjustments, make changes, and iterate that intervention with those changes. And this helps with this idea of a learning process, an adapting learning process. And I think that's very important and very crucial, and we are not doing that enough, again, for a variety of reasons. And the other thing that I think we need to focus on is evaluation. I was talking a bit about evaluation. It doesn't have to be expensive experimental design evaluations. We can work with quasi-experimental and non-experimental, but we also need to start documenting policy interventions. Unfortunately, we do not do this enough. And just for you to have an idea, you know that in Latin America and the Caribbean, homicides is still a very broad problem. We are still the most violent region. This, according to the Global Study on Homicides by UNODC. And despite the fact that we have the highest violent rate, of the highest violent levels according to homicide rates, you would assume that because of those high levels and those persistent high levels of violence, that the region would have prioritized that issue and would have designed a lot of interventions to try to address that specific problem. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that proliferation of policy interventions to address homicides. There is a study produced by Ignacio Cano and Emiliano Rojido. They made a huge effort to try to identify, to map, and to document all the policy interventions that have been designed and implemented in the region, in the Americas, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the last 25 years. And the most difficult thing for them was to find these policy interventions. They were only able to find in the last 25 years, being homicide such a pervasive and continuous problem, they were only able to find 109 interventions. And of those interventions, only 16.5 had some kind of evaluation. So I would like to stress the need to putting more emphasis on research, particularly on active research, this idea of having academic researchers working hand in hand with practitioners on very specific community-based crime and disorder problems, working together to find solutions, and building in an evaluation phase or evaluation a procedure or methodology to try to understand whether it works or not, and to start documenting whatever it is that we are doing in terms of policy interventions. And let's not just stay like in the national level, talking about national security plans or national crime prevention plans. Let's try to bring those plans in very targeted policies, focusing on very specific, geographically based and defined crime and disorder problems, incorporating some kind of evaluation and documenting those policies, the results of those policies, so that we can start sharing this knowledge amongst us. So I guess that would be my final point.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. I think that links us back. Massimo, I wanted to ask you to please give us a reference to the ethnography that you mentioned about enforcement in France. It sounds like something that I would really love to connect with. I wonder if you could maybe pop it in the chat, but also with that, maybe we can also get your closing comments on the link between these knowledge systems and policy.
Yes, I'll post it in the chat in a moment. But first, your question. I think that there are two elements I'd like to stress. One is that we need to build this community, this extended community, needs to build alliances also with national statistical offices. And I would suggest that in the perspective also of looking at how innovative they are trying to be with respect to the whole issue of governance statistics. The key policy forum there is the Praia City Group on Governance Statistics. They published the Handbook on Governance Statistics, which uses a conceptual framework articulated in 8 dimensions. They are all relevant to our conversation of today, but there are 2 in particular that are very relevant. Specifically relevant. One is access to quality justice, and the other one is safety and security. So in their conceptual framework about governance and statistics, there are already the, so to speak, entry points for making the case for knowledge that I think emerges from today's conversation. The second suggestion I have is that, and that is something that with Anna Alvazzi from the Small Arms Project in particular, we are trying to do together, is to build alliances with other institutions that are working in the broad spectrum, especially the spectrum of SDG 16 plus within the 2030 agenda. Of course, there are other goals that are highly relevant to what we have been talking about today. For example, the 11, the 5, and others. But I'd like to stress the importance of building alliances on data producers that are non-official. So integrating official statistics, official data, and non-official data in ways that can be used by policymakers, can be made accessible to policymakers, can be used also by those who evaluate and assess the impact of policies for policymakers. That is, I think, a key element that in the experience we have produced so far is highly relevant. We have created an alliance called SDG 16 Data Initiative, and we have a database which is online and a global report produced every year, in which we combine the official indicators for each of the targets of the SDG 16 with some other indicators that sometimes members of the alliance are producing, sometimes other partners, other institutions are producing. And these are perception-based indicators or experience-based indicators. In some cases, also indicators that are drawn from citizen surveys. I think that is exactly the type of information that official indicators miss because they are too sensitive. They are perceived as politically sensitive. They tend to be considered as non-reliable, not enough robust. But in fact, they measure the invisibilities that are so crucial in order to assess urban safety. Some of the things that we discussed today are actually captured through those indicators, and we should expand the range of non-official data that should be integrated with official data. More on these, of course, in bilateral conversations for whoever is interested in knowing more about this. One final point, and it's about COVID-19. I think that we need to beware of the challenges posed by the pandemic, also in another respect. Many have paid attention to the barriers to data gathering provoked by physical distancing, and the need to collect data through other means, especially through connectivity. But that doesn't capture, of course, all those who do not have access to the internet or have limited connectivity. There are many issues also about tracing information that is sensitive through these type of surveys or means, and the manipulation of these data for other purposes, which would be social control, essentially. But there is another aspect that I think we should be aware of, and that is the huge investments of the recovery and the response post-COVID and the pandemic. We at IDEA have addressed also the issue of capture, especially by organized crime, of those resources that are channeled in order to provide or strengthen public service infrastructures. I think that is a major threat that will emerge as of the next months, actually, and for the years to come. And understanding and conceptualizing that, framing it in a preventative conceptual framework would be very important in order to cope with the next challenges that we'll experience in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Massimo. So frustrating. We've got 4 minutes left. Adele, I don't know if you would like to make some final comments there. I see that there's a whole lot going on in the chat here, which I will download and include in our analysis, but I would prefer to have an opportunity to hear from you before we close, Adele, than to go through the questions.
Thank you so much. Just by way of clarification with respect to our monitoring of the murder rate, it is one of the areas of emphasis for the InfoSegura project in terms of a key citizen security indicator. And I agree with you in terms of us looking beyond these types of indicators. I'm very pleased with what you projected on screen. And I think that I would like to have a conversation with my chief executive officer and with the minister responsible for home affairs on this, because we are looking for new ways of dealing with the whole problem of public safety, and particularly in the Belize City area. So in terms of the murder rate on a national level, we've seen it decline every year since 2017. But during 2020, the year, of course, where there was a lot of heavy policing and intervention specifically focused at gang members, we saw nationally a substantial decline. But interestingly, in the Belize City area, which is our main urban center for the country, we saw the same amount of murders as we did in the previous year. Despite all the heavy policing, despite the state of emergencies where they rounded up gang members and sent them to prison for 30 days on a number of occasions during the year. So it really, to me, drove home the point that it's not all about policing. It's not all about policing, because if your efforts have then so drastically, yet you didn't see a decline in the murders, then we need to really have a different approach on this, right? And I think it really underscored the point, and I think all that's been discussed here today in terms of looking now beyond just these traditional elements of how safe is our city, or how do we make our city safer, because it's the end goal, as you said, right? How do we make our city safer? And Belize City, I think, is case in point. And I would very much welcome a conversation about the whole Belize City area. I put in the chat the link to a study that was done by a Caribbean researcher some years ago. Nobody has paid him any attention. You know, this was a study that was done. It was made public in the public domain, and saying a lot of the things that I'm sure is not just a Belize experience. Other urban centers may have gone through similar experiences, but we have not really used this knowledge in a way that it would create any sort of substantial change. I think in 2020, in 2021, we should not be where we are, given the knowledge base that has been made available to us. And I think the biggest challenge there is, how do we then get our policymakers in the government sector to listen? Because our international partners have been using this information. They've been listening. In fact, I would say that the information that's made available in the repository and from the observatory is used more by our international partners than our government officials. I'm telling you, you know, and there's a need there for us to look at how we can engage them in a different way. Maybe it is that we don't need to be talking statistics. Maybe this is a conversation that we need to have with them, you know, because I think as politicians, quote unquote, they want to be able at the end of the term to be able to tell the people, you know what, our societies are now safer than they were when we came to power. If even we could measure that in any way, I think that would be something for them to celebrate. And maybe that is how we need to motivate them. So I think I very much appreciate this conversation. And I would also want to then brief my CEO and minister on this, because I really think this is something that they will embrace. We are right now crafting a 2-year crime strategy, and I am actually working with my CEO on this. They want to inject some of these new ideas and new dimensions. And I think this session is very timely, because if you send me whatever resources may be relevant, I will do my best to see how we could actually integrate some of this into our crime strategy for the next 2 years. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Del. You will definitely stay in touch. And the same goes for the SDG Database Alliance, Massimo. I think we'll definitely be reaching out to hear more about that. We are officially out of time. I wish that we could go on chatting. Ariane, I'm sorry that I haven't come back to you for a third time, but you did introduce us to this topic around the link between knowledge systems and policy. So hopefully we've had some of the value of your insights there. Thank you so much to the speakers for joining us, and to everybody else. We will look properly at the questions that people have posted. Toby, I hope you've got a record of the chat. Otherwise, I will get it quickly before I leave. And hopefully we will see you all next week, Wednesday, for the final in the webinar series to catch up. So thank you so much, Massimo, Karen, Ariane, and Adele, and everybody else. And have a lovely day for those of you in the morning still, and have a lovely evening for those of us heading out. Thank you. Bye.